Good afternoon, everybody. How's your 175th anniversary going? I have almost no time here at all because we have a packed program, but I first want to welcome you to Paideia Connections, engaging scholarly conversations. And I first want you to join me in thanking a whole long list of individuals who have been extremely helpful in making this event a reality. And they are, I'm just going to read through the whole list, and then let's thank them all together with me. Sue Smith, Debbie Pauley, Catherine Stollard, Cindy Locke, all the Brown Chairholders and University Scholar, especially Brown Chairholder Dr. Eric Selbin, who really masterminded this whole thing. Students, Morgan Patterson, Allie Dillon, Livy Drummond, Penny Wong, and of course our two speakers for the afternoon, Eileen Cleere and Scott McLean. Would you thank them for me, please? For those of you who have not attended one of these in the past, first of all, shame on you. This is our third in a series. They're offered every semester, and I encourage all of you to engage in future such conversations. This is a very unusual operation, so I want to give you the instructions because you will play an active role. We are going to have two scholarly lectures by two of our faculty about their cutting-edge current research. They will each last about 18 minutes, 40 seconds, appropriately for the day. And they will be talking about their work, but for a general audience. After those two 20-minute presentations, they'll be introduced by some of our speakers. They will sit here, and they're going to listen to you for the last 20 minutes, as you will make connections between these two presentations of any sort that you see fit. I will moderate that session, and I'm not afraid to cold call. So you need to be actively listening throughout these first two lectures, and I've got my notes here to write things down and see what I can come up with. You should do the same, and please enjoy this. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. My name is Morgan Patterson, and I am a sophomore English and History double major. It is my great honor, and I mean that wholeheartedly, to introduce Dr. Eileen Cleere. Dr. Cleere received her PhD from Rice University in 1996. She specializes in Victorian literature and culture and has more recently been teaching in the Feminist Film Studies course. Her recent research has focused on the intersection of Victorian aesthetic theory and sanitation reform. And I know for a fact that she has an exciting new project up her sleeve, but you didn't hear that from me. When Dr. Cleere invited me to introduce her today, my immediate response was, absolutely. Dr. Cleere was one of my first professors here at Southwestern, and if I'm being perfectly honest, she is still one of my favorites. For one, Dr. Cleare's zeal for Victorian literature is contagious. Well, at least I certainly caught the bug. Beyond this, Dr. Cleere is a no-nonsense instructor who has truly taught me the value of questioning everything, including myself. As she likes to say, we are not as far removed from those wacky Victorians as we would often like to think. Okay, so maybe she doesn't say wacky, but the sentiment is the same. Even more than that, though, Dr. Cleere has made me feel at home here on the Southwestern campus, regardless of whether we are discussing classic literature or chatting about our crazy academia-fueled lives. It has been my privilege to learn under Dr. Cleare's tutelage. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Cleere to the stage.
Apparently, I only have 18 minutes and 40 seconds to speak, so I'd like to say a few things before I begin. First of all, thank you to the Brown Chairholders and to President Berger for inviting me to speak on this important Founders Day about my research. Thank you to Dr. Eric Selbin for organizing everything and for Morgan Patterson for her fabulous introduction. This is a very new project for me. In fact, this is the first time I've ever spoken publicly about it, so I'm really happy to have the opportunity. I'm a Victorianist, which means I'm always asking students to read this, when what they really like to be reading is this, and what they really, really probably want to be reading is this. This is a bit of a pedagogical conundrum. 150 years, and presumably many formidable levels of intellectual and literary value separate Lady Audley's Secret, published in 1862, from The Hunger Games, Twilight, and especially 50 Shades of Grey, published in the early days of our own 21st century. So bridging the gap between the frowsy past and the exhilarating present must, of course, be a non-starter, impossible to achieve, blasphemous to attempt. But I'm going to ask you to contemplate something shocking. What if, in 150 years, 50 Shades of Grey is the canonical favorite of the new feminist movement, taught by my replacements in her 21st century British women's course? Obscene, horrendous. Only a nightmarish dystopian society could elevate such sensational matter to literary canonicity and choose to teach the works of Erica Leonard, pen name E.L. James, next to the works of Zadie Smith and Hilary Mantel. But both Lady Audley's Secret and 50 Shades of Grey were wildly popular books of their respective time periods. Both were considered shocking and vulgar by the intelligentsia. Both were read, surreptitiously or not, by readers who liked them and shared them, surreptitiously or not, with their friends. The first argument I'd like to make today is that books don't stay put. They move, they shift shape, and you can trace their movement by what they look like, who reads them, when they read them, and why they read them. Scholars in my field, English literature, have come to realize this over the last 10 years, questioning strict definitions of indigeneity and periodicity that leave old books languishing in an unreachable past, identified only by the rusty protocols of British survey courses, cobwebby, dusty, tied to ever-receding birth times and birthplaces. The idea isn't that books transcend history, it's that they have multiple histories. A history of having been written and published, to be sure, but also a longer, much more complicated history of having been reprinted, repackaged, translated, abridged, adapted, staged, and alas, spark-noted. And if I can demonstrate that vibrant migration for my students, I can maybe capture something about Victorian fiction that forces it to leap forward in time, a little or a lot, to rise up to meet my ever younger students in their own birth times and birthplaces. So here I begin my talk today to you about the adolescent afterlife of Victorian sensation fiction, featuring the now famous, now canonical, Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. As I mentioned earlier, Lady Audley's Secret was always a novel in motion. It was a runaway bestseller from the moment of its publication, which happened first serially and then as a complete edition in a triple-decker in 3 volumes, as they were called. Lady Audley's Secret is the most important and perhaps most infamous example of a genre of literature that rose to literary prominence in the 1860s in England, dubbed at the time sensation fiction. The sensational 60s were sensational for many cultural reasons, relating mostly to changes in Victorian marriage law. Most importantly, the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act moved divorce proceedings from ecclesiastical to civil courts and made it easier and cheaper for so many more miserable couples to legally separate. Sensation fiction reveled in the new dramatic opportunities for representing courtship and marriage as tumultuous and possibly temporary. featuring the spectacle of divorce frequently, but also bigamy, polygamy, blackmail, forgery, arson, mistaken identity, murder. And finally, the thrilling possibility that unhappy spouses could conveniently fake their own deaths. These books were also sensational because they supposedly excited your body rather than your mind. They made you feel fear, passion, horror, rage, jealousy, and perhaps most dangerously, desire. Feelings that were at best unladylike and at worst non-monogamous or even queer. Feelings absolutely corrupting to the cloistered and bored middle-class women whose leisure time and disposable income made them sensationalism's obvious target audience. So now, even though I teach Lady Audley's Secret with look-alike texts like Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens and Middlemarch by George Eliot, it much more closely resembled this when it was published in the 1860s, and probably approximated this, or even this, or perhaps even this, to the adolescent girls who are reading it in the other novel I want to talk to you about today, Betsy and Tacy Go Downtown by Maud Hart Lovelace. This adolescent novel was first published in North America in 1943, which makes it one of the first novels ever to be written for a new group of readers, identified not as adult, but as young adult, a brand new literary genre in the middle of the 20th century, which of course is now a mainstay of the publishing industry. Well, just about everyone, even college professors, reads adolescent literature today. It's worth remembering that it was originally for children. It was invented as a genre in order to separate a new category of maturing teenage readers from their more sophisticated elders, crucially prolonging the duration of American childhood at a historical moment that was pressuring young people to rapidly come of age. 17th Summer by Maureen Daly is generally recognized to be the first adolescent novel. Daly was herself 17 when she wrote this groundbreaking story about a high school girl on the cusp of college matriculation and the basketball star who loves her but is headed to another state to work in his uncle's bakery. Unlike Bella of Twilight, Daly's Angie Morrow never commits herself to her beau, never pledges her body, or reveals anything but chaste affection for the handsome, popular boy, even though she is 17 and legally old enough to marry. Even though previous generations of teenagers, like Lizzie Bennet from Pride and Prejudice and the eponymous Jane Eyre, married early, adolescent novels like 17th Summer provided examples of young heroines finding other things to occupy their time. These novels repeatedly foreground girls who openly choose to exchange the private, passionate, and sometimes heated emotional life of adolescence for a set of calmer community pleasures newly offered to girls by civic institutions like the public university. This is the argument I'd like to make today about the fourth installment of Lovelace's wildly popular novels about growing up that appeared at the same historical moment as 17th Summer. As lovers of Lovelace may remember, the plot of Betsy and Tacy Go Downtown is thrillingly set into motion when 11-year-old Tacy Kelly's Irish father becomes enraged and offended upon discovering an apparently nasty book hidden under his daughter's mattress. As Tacy sobbingly reports to her horrified friends, he said there was a set of Dickens in the house, and Shakespeare, and Father Finn, and how did a child of his happen to be reading trash? The filthy tome is, of course, none other than Lady Audley's Secret, our canonical classic. Although Braddon's novel wouldn't have looked like this in the 1900s, when Tacy and her friends would have read it. Instead, Tacy's book is most probably a yellowback edition, a pulp edition, cheaply made, convenient to carry, easy to hide, and with the added feature of impermanence, disintegrating quickly, marketed to an unsophisticated audience at railway stations and drugstore counters, and designed for only a few surreptitious readings before it literally became trash. Trash like this also incinerates quickly, as we see when Mr. Kelly unceremoniously tosses the slickly bound paper volume into the kitchen stove, a for Lady Audley that would seem to put her intertextual significance in Lovelace's tale. Yet the spontaneous book burning only prompts the surreptitious purloining of a second copy to replace the first copy, which has been most unsuitably borrowed from Mrs. Ray's hired girl, Rena. And the reverberations from Lady Audley's transnational resurrection continue to shape the melodrama of American girlhood for Tacy and her best friends, Betsy and Tib. Sensationalism, a dangerous literary pleasure associated with the secret longings and desires of women, especially by the mid-20th century with working-class women, is forced into the open in Lovelace's children's book, reinterpreted as a precipitous stage of female development where the intensely private rituals of adolescence must be made normatively public and rechanneled to civic institutions like the community theater and the new Carnegie Library for self-improvement. When Lady Audley is pulpily and pejoratively resurrected by Lovelace, she is used to provoke and ultimately repress the teething, seething emotional life of precocious, pre-adolescent, turn-of-the-century Midwestern girls. It is easy to understand why Braddon's 1862 novel would appeal to preteen readers at the turn of the century, featuring a very young, very beautiful female criminal who is driven to desperate deeds by the poverty, abuse, and neglect of a motherless girlhood. Lady Audley's Secret is a wild narrative romp that ultimately ends with the incarceration of Lucy Malden Graham Talboys Audley in a madhouse in Belgium. Like Judy Blume's Forever or V.C. Andrews's Flowers in the Attic, Lady Audley's Secret is a book that is fervently circulated and privately devoured by girls on the brink of emotional and sexual maturity. For this reason, it's also easy to understand why Lady Audley's Secret would end up in the fire. The anxiety that youthful readers might be exposed to novels like Braddon's is particularly pronounced in the conservative response to sensation fiction that began at the very moment of its inception. Apparently, young, impressionable girls might be encouraged by such novels to indulge, quote, impulsive, stormy, and passionate feelings, while simultaneously developing habits of secrecy and deception. And they might come to realize that the most dangerous premise of sensational writing is true, that adult femininity is itself an extravagant and duplicitous fiction, a set of performative behaviors that barely screen the humiliations and desires of a too recently abandoned girlhood. You see, adolescence was an undifferentiated category in Victorian culture. While that word itself dates to the 18th century, the lengthy temporal transition between childhood and adulthood that we now associate with the term was only invented at the turn of the century, when sexual development began to be prioritized by psychologists, and perfected during World War II, when child labor laws proposed in the 19th century finally went into effect. The age of consent, or rather the age of sexual the 1860s, only rising to a suitably more mature 13 in 1875, well after Braddon's novel was published. Given that adolescence as any kind of safe harbor from adult sexuality was unthinkable in the mid-19th century, it's not surprising that Braddon's novel represents the passage to adulthood as uncertain, unstable, and precariously brief, visible only in a tumultuous paragraph Lucy spends at a Torquay boarding school between the ages of 10 and 16, and in the so-called madness she inherits from her mother. Yes, Lucy's mother also had difficulty with the transition to adult femininity, and now permanently resides in the only place a lengthy Victorian girlhood is allowed, the asylum. But Lucy's so-called madness settles in at 17 when she is abandoned without warning by her husband with an infant, a husband who expects serious. Can we really for shoving him down a well when he finally reappears, shocked to find her living under an assumed identity and remarried to a rich baronet. Yes, Lucy's bigamy, selfishness, and violence are bad examples for young girl readers, to be sure, but it's also Lucy's mastery of melodrama that is so troubling here. Her uncanny ability to invent and perform a host of different emotions and identities as she eludes capture in the confines of monogamy. These are survival skills that can only be explained in a mid-Victorian novel by a belated diagnosis of madness. But for young adult readers at the turn of the century, Lucy Malden is the girl on fire. A sociopathic seductress, to be sure, but also a misunderstood and exploited teenager, fed by rage and resentment rather than insanity. Unlike Braddon, Maud Hart Lovelace was thinking about adolescence at the very moment adolescence became thinkable. Crafting a 10-volume series about how the girlhood journey from preschool to adolescence to marriage must be carefully managed and even prolonged by vigilant parents who slowly reveal the vista of adulthood to their sensitive, high-strung girls. Surfacing in the 4th volume of Lovelace's cherished Betsy Tacy series, Lady Audley's Secret is employed as shorthand for the dangers of prematurity. With Braddon's help, Lovelace is able to pinpoint that feverish moment in social and sexual development when girls can apparently go either way. They can go downtown, immediately succumbing to a dangerous private world of seething, tumultuous adolescence, or they can literally go downtown and be mentored and coached back into a phase of innocent post-childhood, where they can remain for several additional crucial years. This critical moment is vividly on display in the opening of the novel, which is uncharacteristically unsubtle for Lovelace, and to my modest Victorianist ears, almost vulgarly Freudian. Here, 11-year-old Betsy Warrington Ray is seated comfortably in the crotch of a forked tree in her backyard, looking out over a landscape that includes not the big hill of past childish picnics and other adventures, but instead the world yet unexplored of Deep Valley, with its tempting triangle of secular temples, the Opera House, the skeleton of the new Carnegie Library, and the high school. In an adjacent tree crotch, I'm serious, Betsy has nailed a cigar box with a plump, coquettish lady wearing a Spanish shawl pictured on the cover. Inside the box are Betsy's notebooks of secret writing, featuring novels in progress with titles like The Repentance of Lady Clinton, Her Secret Marriage, The Tall, Dark Stranger, and, perhaps most appropriately, Hardly More Than a Child. The forked tree is Betsy's private study and workspace, the only place she can find outside of her crowded middle-class home to brood and indulge her fantasies of bigamy and blackmail, sexual conquest and revenge. When Tacy Kelly asks permission to hoist herself into a third crotch and tearfully shares the news of Lady Audley's incineration, Betsy's indignant response reflects her powerful investment in sensation fiction. "Trash," cries Betsy in horror. "I'm trying to write books just like it." Although Lady Audley travels great distances, geographically and temporally, to reach the tween girls of Deep Valley, Minnesota, where she is repackaged rather brutally as pulp fiction, she gives us the measure of Betsy's private fantasies, supplying an available synecdoche for the unprovided content of Betsy's sensationally titled tales. The synecdoche becomes important when the impending winter forces Betsy indoors, and her mother catches a glimpse of her private notebooks. "I think," says Mrs. Ray at last, "that Rena must have been sharing her dime novels with you." Discerning at once the inappropriate wellspring of Betsy's secret reading material, Mrs. Ray manages to communicate not disdain, but disappointment. realizing the pressing need to provide her precocious daughter with alternative fantasies of identification and desire. Conveniently for Betsy and her mother, the new Carnegie Library is about to open its doors in downtown Deep River. Mrs. Ray persuades Betsy's father that Betsy shall have her own library card and that she will spend bi-monthly Saturdays reading alone but in public under the supervision of the watchful librarian in a space dedicated entirely to age-appropriate literature. In the children's room at the Carnegie Library, prematurity can be parried, staved off with a more healthful variety of Victorian literature like the Pickwick Papers and the Water Babies, books I never teach. When Betsy arrives in the children's room, appropriately dressed in her best hat and a purse borrowed from her elder sister, the private agonies of adolescence are externalized, costumed, and forced into the safe bureaucratic space of the public library. As a disciplinary institution, the library works almost too well. Even the first hint of borrowing privileges from a legitimate circulating collection is enough to condemn Lady Clinton to Lady Audley's fiery fate. Betsy voluntarily burns her sensational private writing in her own kitchen fire, never returning to the fork tree, the cigar box, or the secret fantasy of Braddon-inspired authorship. Either the book burns or the girl burns, Lovelace's novel seems to insist. But while Lady Audley's Secret disappears as a material signifier for Betsy and her friends, the Victorian legacy of sensationalism remains present as an ongoing peril and pleasure of female development that not even the public library can altogether solve. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Allie Dillon, and I'm a senior graduating this May with a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology. It is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Scott McLean. Dr. McLean graduated from the College of Worcester in 1987 with a Bachelor of Arts in Physics. At this very college, he discovered his passion for biomechanics. He furthered his studies at Arizona State University and received his PhD in exercise science and biomechanics in 1994. Dr. McLean began his teaching career at Iowa State University in 1995, where he was an assistant professor for the Department of Health and Human Performance. He began teaching in the kinesiology department at Southwestern University in 2001. He has been a department chair since 2009 and has been a professor of kinesiology since 2010. At Southwestern, Dr. McLean has received honors such as the Brown Research Fellow, the William B. Jones Fellow, and the Mundy Faculty Fellow. An avid researcher, Dr. McLean has accumulated a large array of published manuscripts, but most notable of these is his work done with USA Swimming and the United States Olympic Committee. Combining his knowledge of swimming and biomechanics, Dr. McLean has worked side by side with Olympic swimmers to improve their chances of earning a gold medal. When he is not in the lab or the classroom, you can find Dr. McLean in his happy place at the pool. He has been a volunteer assistant swim coach for the Southwestern swim team since 2002 and has been involved with the local Aquadios program since 2005. I am grateful to have had the opportunity to work with Dr. McLean over the past year on capstone research, but more importantly, I am grateful that he introduced to me my passion and future profession, the study of biomechanics. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome you, Dr. Scott McLean.
Good afternoon and welcome. Let me echo Dr. Cleere in thanking Dr. Berger, the Brown chairs, our university scholar, and Dr. Eric Selman in particular for putting today's event together. I think you'll find it entertaining but challenging at the same time. I also wanted to start, it's Charter Day, and I was trying to figure a way of somehow tying my talk into Charter Day. And I found it to be quite challenging. Clearly in 1840, swimming was not a big part of Southwestern's history. So how could we tie swimming into 1840? Well, maybe we could look at the American record in the 50 free. Nathan Adrian, 1866, that's not quite. Maybe the US Open record, Cesar Cielo, 1847. Well, we can't round down, so that doesn't work. Gonna have to do some work. So I went, I actually did my due diligence, did a little extra work, and I found it. 1840 in London was the site of the very first recorded competitive swim race. Mr. Hunslow won a 400-yard river race in a fast time of 7 minutes and 9 seconds and was awarded the first national title. The fact that it was recorded is why we look at it as the beginning of competitive swimming. And if I remember correctly, I believe these are the early days of Victorian England, and so I think I might get credit for the first Paideia connection of the day. So, well, on with the show. So my talk is entitled, I Shouldn't Have Filed My Nails Last Night, or When Every 100th of a Second Counts. And I want to couch this whole talk today in a story. I'll begin it now, I'll finish it at the end. This is Dara Torres. In 2008, she was 41 years old, a new mother, and she decided to make a comeback. She had the fastest time in the United States at that time going into the Olympic trials. Still considered a long shot, though, to make the Olympic team. And when she went to the Olympic trials, not only did she win, she broke her own American record twice. This picture is actually taken a few weeks later at the pre-Olympic training camp at Stanford University. I had the great honor of going out and working with the team for a week there. And this was one of the swimmers that I was able to work with. And our group, as we were setting up for her to come over, she walked up, she said, "Boys, if you give me 0.2 of a second, I'll give you a gold medal." I said, "All right, well, let's get to work." So at that point, we headed off and started doing what we do. Now, in hindsight, as I reflect back on that, I think about what led me to that point. And this was the culmination of a large amount of time and a large amount of research that brought me to that point. So I'm going to start at the beginning and talk a little bit about how I got to where I was at this point and actually then continue on to where I am today. So when you are approaching a new area of research, you want to have a good idea of what you're trying to talk about and what you're trying to investigate. And the first thing that I tell my students is think about the activity and identify what the goal of that activity is. Once you know the goal of activity, then start looking at what will determine, what factors determine that goal. So in a start, the goal is to achieve the fastest time you possibly can in what's considered the start. That's made up of the time you spend on the block, the time you spend in the air, and the time you spend in the water prior to starting your actual race, the swimming portion of the race. After that, then you start looking for mathematical and mechanical relationships that will determine the factors above them. And this is what we call a deterministic model. There's several students in the audience right now that are doing this this very semester in one of my classes. It's a great way, it's a great exercise to really organize your thoughts and really think about what's important. So in the early days of swimming start research, there was a study that was recited many, many times that indicated that the glide time was the most important to starting because it correlated most highly with starting time. And anybody that's had statistics knows that there is a danger in looking at correlations and drawing these types of conclusions. And in fact, in my model, if you look at it, you can see that while glide time might be correlated well with starting time, it's really the stuff you do on the block. What happens at takeoff that ends up deciding how good your flight's going to be, how good your glide's going to be. So that's where I decided to put all of my efforts. So this was one of the first studies that we undertook. This was back in Iowa. And at that time, these new blocks came out that were big. And so they allowed us to do more things. This was about twice the size of an old block. And so we looked at relay starts and flat starts. And we filmed our swimmers doing their starts. And then we performed a kinematic analysis to determine what was going to happen. And in that kinematic analysis, you create a mathematical model of the body from which you can glean lots of different information, velocities, accelerations, and so forth. It looks cool. You get great graphics and animations that come out of it. And we had a really good set of data and a nice article that came from this as well. But that's about as far as it goes. It stays in the lab, stays in the research journals. How do we take this information to the swimmers? One of the problems is that it takes a long time to do this work. So if you think about that video that you were watching there, it was about 2 seconds long. It's about 120 pictures. In each picture, you have to click on 21 points on the body to create that model. You might have 10 to 12 trials per person. You might have 10 to 20 people in a study. That's a lot of hours in front of the computer trying to generate these data. It's not effective. So we started looking for ways that we could speed up the process. And one of the ways was to move from a kinematic analysis to a kinetic analysis, looking at the forces. We can measure forces quickly, we can turn that stuff around, and we can get to it. So our first attempt was to mount a force plate on the block that we were using for that previous study. Back then, we had to be a little bit inventive in the way we approached things, so we used some high-tech waterproofing, and it worked. We were able to generate a really good set of kinetic data. We got the exact same information in terms of takeoff characteristics in a much shorter period of time, and more importantly, we could then report those data back to the swimmers in a fraction of the time that we had in terms of the other stuff that we were doing. So we were on our way. We had some really interesting stuff that was going to happen. Meanwhile, my colleagues in Arizona and Colorado were continuing to develop this instrumented, this force starting block. I made the move down here to Texas. We continued some conversations, some work, and in the mid-2000s, kind of connected back up with them as we started doing some additional work. And one of the reasons was, at that time, there was some rumors of a new block that was coming out that was going to have some new features. It wasn't just going to be a bigger block, but it was going to have, there we go, it'll have these wedges or these inclines on the back of the block, very similar to what you would see in a track starting block from track and field. And there may be handles that they could use on these blocks, and so you get more out of your arms. But we really didn't know what the effect of those would be, and the idea was that these might come into the 2008 games. So we wanted to be out in front of this and really understand what the idea what would happen when you start using these. And so we undertook this study, nearly 60 highly competitive swimmers all the way up to the Olympic level, nearly 700 starts that were analyzed, a large number of different conditions that we considered, and we were able to generate detailed kinetic and kinematic profiles of all of these different variations of starts. And I won't bore you with lots of details. I'll come up with a summary of what we found. And the word that we used when we finished this study was startling. The handles were fantastic. They were absolutely what you want to use. And when I see swimmers, I say, if you see handles on the block, use them. They're great. The wedge, which seemed to be the hot topic of the day, was really not very good. In fact, the thing that I want you to keep in mind here is this one right here, the takeoff angle. It went down, which meant that the trajectory of the swimmer started going down more instead of out. And that put them in the water faster. It put them into a medium that had a lot more resistance or drag. And so from our view, that was a negative impact. So we waited, and basically what we found was some countries right before the Olympic Games said that they didn't have enough time to prepare to use these new blocks. So they delayed and waited until they had after the Games to introduce the new block design. But it didn't prevent us from going in and using the whole system that we developed to measure all of this stuff with the old block style and use it with the Olympic team. And so now we're back in 2008 at the pre-Olympic training camp. And we spent a week there working closely with these swimmers, providing lots of information to them, and we had very good positive feedback from the swimmers. They really liked the attention. But when we were done, we sat down and said, well, what's the next step? What can we do? How can we take this information here and get it in here? Because, right now, the stuff that we were doing was too scientific. My colleague, Dr. Sanders in the UK, often talks about that. It's good to have a good scientific foundation for things, but you have to be able to communicate it in a way that people will understand. My colleague, Dr. Vint, who worked with me at the camp, was a little more blunt and just basically said, we need a system that doesn't require 2 PhDs to run. It'd be better to have a coach and some swimmers that could sit there and do this. So we undertook this project in 2010, design a better starting block, still with the instrumentation, and really focus on the application side of things, how we can provide that feedback. We went back to exactly where we started back in the mid-90s. Go with this visual approach, have these trajectories that are easily generated, and use that as the lead information, and then tie it into other things that we could provide for them. And so this is what we came up with. This is the block, and as you look at it, you'll see that there are 3 force plates up here for the flat start, 1 for the back foot, for the front foot, 1 for the hands, and then we actually added in the capability to do backstroke starts as well. This block is the exact dimensions of the new Omega block, which was going to be introduced into the International Swimming Circle. So it was something that was really met with a lot of enthusiasm from the swimming community. So we had the infrastructure, we had the equipment. Now we had to see where we wanted to go with that. And over the next really 18, almost 24 months, we worked primarily on application. How can we develop a program that provides the feedback that we want? Meanwhile, at the same time, we wanted to be able to capture that information in some sort of form so we could build a database and do some research with it as well. And this was what we came up with. So we have this type of feedback on the bottom of the screen where we have synchronized above and below water videos. Off the block, you'll see those red, green, and yellow lines. Those are force vectors representing the forces under the front and the back foot, as well as the hands. And on the player, you can actually step through it frame by frame, so you can look at it a little bit more carefully. And then we have a summary screen at the end that gives them some quantitative statistics that allows them to evaluate their starts. We use this with a large number of teams and high-level athletes, and it was something that was really rewarding for everyone involved. But that leaves the research part out of it, and I always imply that this was an important aspect too. We have to understand the start better. We have to understand the effect of using this block better. So I was fortunate enough to be given the chance to bring the block here to Georgetown. In fact, it's still here, and we've been using it for research projects here on campus. So in 2013, my student, Dylan Johnson, was part of the SCOPE program in the summer. And we started off with a fairly simple project where we were going to examine what happens when you change the position of the wedge, because that's a big deal. Swimmers always, they have to have their personal preference of wedge position. So we had people try starts from a number of different positions, and the long story short is, it really didn't make a difference. And we still saw the negative impact of having the wedge, forcing them down into the water. So I was confounded. I'm like, why are we putting so much effort into this block design when it seems to have some negative impacts? Well, over the last year or so, I've been able to partner with a starting block company and try out some new ideas. They're really open to trying new things and seeing what happens. So if we take a little walk down memory lane here, the old blocks, when blocks first were introduced into competitive swimming, it was simply to raise them up above the water and allow them to jump from a higher height. And that was great. And then they figured out that if you tilted the block a little bit, you got a better start. And so then they came along and said, well, let's keep adding stuff. Let's keep adding a wedge on the back, because it's always about adding. It's never about making the best decisions. And in my opinion, that's not a good thing, right? That's forcing us down into the water. So I approached them. I said, well, what if we leave the wedge, because now we can use the back foot better, and we flatten out the block. So 2 students, Ashley Mulder, Ariana Weeks, worked over the summer, and they're continuing to work during the school year here to try and finish up this project. And we collected data back to the old school kinematic analysis, and yes, there were many times when they were sleepy. We found the same thing. The addition of the wedge had a negative impact. It forced them into a lower trajectory. The velocities that they were using were actually improved coming off of the block. And so when you look at the combinations, you can make the argument that perhaps using the level block with the wedge kind of gave you the best of both worlds, a flatter trajectory with a higher takeoff velocity. And that's kind of where we are right now. We're not really sure where things are going to go. We're looking at some other ideas as well, and particularly with the handles. But we continue to work with USA Swimming. We're trying to interact with the national and the international team from the US to offer them the best assistance that we can. And it's an exciting, exciting area for me. It's something that motivates me every time I step into the lab, and it really keeps me moving along. So I want to kind of bring this back to where we started from. And if you think about it, it's 20 years now, almost, that I've been looking at swim starts and thinking about it. And it kind of brought me to this point of being able to work with Dara. And I'll finish up by telling you how the story ends with her. So we know that she broke 2 American records in the Olympic trials, best American swimmer. She wants 0.2 of a second. We work with her, and she goes to the Olympic Games, and she goes 24:07, 0.18 seconds faster, breaks her record yet again. Fantastic. Britta Stephan went 24:06. She had a silver medal again. It was really disappointing. But if you think about it, I mean, she's 41, and she had 3 American records that year. I'm like, what a great story. And I was part of it. I was able to help write some of that. And that was a lot of fun. And it's something that, seeing the applied side of the research that we do in the lab, that keeps bringing me back. So the other part of the talk was, you know, when every 100th of a second counts, well, I think we can see 100th of a second. It's the difference between being on a Wheaties box and eating from one. So I couldn't do all of this work without a very large cast to help me, and I want to thank them for this. I want to thank the organizations that have supported me, and most of all, I want to thank you for your attention today.
Would you please welcome both speakers to the stage? So, and I don't know if we could turn up the house lights anymore, but I can certainly see you, so it's not a problem. I took lots of notes, as I'm sure you did. And I'm going to be, of course, these 2 lectures could not be more the same, obviously. Hey, and you can't leave. I see people, like 2 people leaving. That's not fair because I'm supposed to pick on you. All right, yes, you. Let's open it up and hear some comments. The 2 speakers, by the way, will be available at a very nice reception right out here in the lobby if you actually have questions for them. This is not a question time. This is a time for you to share. We have 2 students that have microphones, and they'll run right to you so that we can hear you. And let's see who wants to start. Be brave enough to be the first one. Jim, right back there, please.
I can't. Hi. Thanks very much to both of you and to everyone involved in organizing this, Eric and Ed and everyone else. I can't resist the obvious question. Scott, what advice would you have for a Victorian husband as he heads down the well? What advice would you have? Oh,
he wants to know during the reception about advice you have for husbands that went down the Victorian well. So, okay. We'll stay tuned for that. Thank you. There's no water in the well, so it's dangerous. You don't want to go down there.
I'll ask a more serious question. Both talks are in some ways about managing human performance, of course, in very different ways. In some respects, Eileen's is about retarding human development, slowing the acceleration of human bodies over time, and you're about, of course, quickening them, hastening them. I was wondering, this is more directed toward you, Scott, whether in terms of managing swimmers, probably non-elite swimmers, whether retarding starting habits was ever an issue or is ever an issue, or not. Novice swimmers, yeah, and for that matter, at collegiate level too.
Well, certainly. I mean, are we doing this with the Q&A here?
I guess so.
Okay. All right. So, yeah. I mean, whenever you work with people who are beginning out, you have to go at a much slower pace in terms of, you know, not only what they're trying to do, but the process by which you want to move through that. It's got to go very slowly, and you have to be patient with it. You have to adjust all of your expectations of what you do. I mean, a common thing for me when you know, Allie mentioned that I work with a youth team here sometimes, and I'm constantly telling them that they have to put forth a 70 or 80% effort, because if they go at 100%, it's just crazy, and they fall all over the place. So sit back and relax a little bit.
Another comment, reaction, David.
I'm going to try to grab a connection before someone else does, and I'll just comment that I've got the word design in both of the presentations, the design of book covers, pulp fiction, what have you, packaging, the design of performance enhancement devices. And I've also got your body rather than your mind, but I don't know what to do with that, and it's not a question, it's just an observation and a confession.
Thank you. Thank you, David. It'll be on.
Okay. I, again, like David, would like to, since this is my first time at one of these, I would like to make my assumptions before they are stolen by someone else. And so I saw two particular things. Can I do two? Is that allowed?
Absolutely, yes, sure.
Both lectures seem to be about challenging assumptions. What's the best block? What's the best fiction to be reading as a preteen? And then I noticed that in both lectures I see a connection that I liked what you said, Scott, about adding rather than making best decisions. And so we certainly saw that with the block design, but we also, I think, see that in the Victorian literature and the way that society, particularly adults, wanted to respond to the way that young women were reading by sending them to the public library or by changing the public consensus to say, that's trash.
Thank you. Great. Yes, please, Austin. They'll get you a mic real soon.
Okay, I definitely feel like there's a sense of progression in both talks, mostly piggybacking off Diana. In the case of the swimmers, we had to challenge toward the paradigm that adding was better, but in reality, going back to the basics and analyzing was the true progression. Furthermore, in the English lecture, we noticed that we are seeing more of a cultural progression rather than, I guess, sticking to traditional paradigms. So,
thank you. Thanks, Austin. By the way, if any of you up there want to make a comment, there are no mics up there, so I'd urge you to either come down or yell really loudly, Steve.
Hey, yeah, I'm glad that David said something about design because I had that on here too, but the other word that I had was body. And the idea that the body is this sort of site of intersection, so that one focuses on the sexual politics of adolescent female body in Victorian literature, and the other one sort of presents the detailed deconstruction of the mechanics of the athlete's body, and both in the structures that allow that. And I noticed that both are sort of, in a way, inherently sexual and sexualized, because sport is, in some ways, a heightened form of sexual display. And both in their own way sort of examine this corporal submersion into a world in which the protagonist or the heroic athlete is not necessarily originally familiar to them, but they're able to enter through the different structures that allow them to, in some ways, make waves throughout history. So that's a little bit of a stretch, but.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, please.
Literature often makes me as sleepy as digitizing.
And there you have it. Thank you, yes. Right up here in the front. I think that might be, is that Mac? I can't tell if it's Mac. Yeah, Mac.
So my thought, I think, is far less eloquent than some of the other things said today. But something Dr. McLean said that I thought was important was getting the technical information to the people and having that translation, if you will. But more importantly, getting it from point A to point B. And I think from the Victorian lecture, there's a similar problem being faced, and these internal feelings at point A have to be expressed somehow, and whether it be through writing in the crotch of a tree or reading in the library, what have you, but that translation of ideas and thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Mac. Oh, and Sebastian. Is that Sebastian? I can't see. Is that you, Sebastian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Dr. Berger. So one of the connections that I saw was in the story of Dara, the U.S. swimmer who was 41 and the mom. She was someone who was an underdog because of her age, and she did something inherently that most young athletes do, going to the Olympics, at least in the sport of swimming. And while in Victorian literature, we start seeing these young adolescents as society tries to keep them essentially young and try to maintain this culture and this idea of preserving this innocence, as we saw in the public library.
Thank you. Great. So impressive. Ed.
I just had the observation that, as someone said, that reading Victorian literature might make them sleepy, that if you just talked with someone and said, oh, I just heard someone talk about the design of how someone jumps into a pool and children's literature in 1860, but when you hear it from someone who's excited about it, doing research on it, brings it alive.
Thank you. Yes.
Both had a concept of information being trapped. One trapped in the Victorian books or era and so on, and the other one being trapped in your research. But in the swimming and the research, there was an appropriate outlet for that particular information, and in the other genre was not necessarily an appropriate outlet for that.
Thanks, Melanie. Wonderful. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Hello, I kind of made the connection between the two, like where the books, like you said, it was starting with a shaping and changing, and you can trace their movements through those who read them. And then with the starting blocks, it was kind of also changing, and you can trace like the history and movements through that, through those who are using the blocks, and kind of like with the technology changing. So.
Thank you. Yes, please. Bob.
This is a connection about staying put, not staying put. One of the first things that Eileen said was that books don't stay put. And I was listening to that and thinking more about that with Scott, and talking about how he doesn't want knowledge to stay put in the researcher's hands, get it translated into the swimmer's hands. And I think that both of these talks speak to the role of the public intellectual, as well as the way that knowledge moves around.
Thank you. Is there? I can't see. There's a hand back.
One of the things that I noticed that I found interesting, and having taken Dr. Cleare's classes, this might also be in relation to that. But I think it's interesting that with the block, some of like the flat block was actually still very useful, even though that was kind of an older idea. And with Victorian era novels, a lot of those ideas and stuff are still prevalent. So it's the fact that not only is there change, but it's also that the original and the older stuff still remains relevant.
Thank you.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I just kind of wanted to point out the fact that both of the talks sort of mentioned time as a factor. So you're looking at, in one case, a very small instance of time, like fractions of a second, that make up the difference between a gold and a silver. And then in the other, you're looking at this small moment where a girl kind of it might be a longer amount of time, but it's this extreme difference between her being a little girl or her being a woman and her being this ambiguous, transient thing that happens kind of on this one moment. So I think time was an interesting connection.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yes, right here.
I have a connection between the desire that we have to win and to be competitive, and the lengths that we will go to discover what kind of differences we can make to improve our starting times in swimming, and the desire to express sexuality and how it's common to surreptitiously read novels that we're not allowed, and just that desire to feel that that flame, that passion.
Thank you. Yes, please, Jean.
What I noticed about the two talks was that they represented change can come in different ways. They can come in big, bold, sensational statements, shocking things that change society, or they can come from moving the platform an inch, which can bring about tremendous change.
Thank you, Jean.
Threatened the other day that you were going to call on me today, and
I threatened to call on you, Joe, so I will now call on you. Joe Royce.
I abstain. Now, this whole thing to me, I'm getting away from some of the contact points and all that, but it's, to me, what it brings up is the debate we hear at some very large schools about value of research in the science areas, value of research in the humanities. We've got some empirical data, some things that are easily judged. We've got results that can be shown on the one area. The other area, opinion, reinterpretation, collaboration among various people. We know who the consumers are of the swimming research. I guess I'm asking, who are our consumers on the literature research? Who collaborates together, and who does that information then get distributed to?
Thank you. What's that? Oh, are you not mic'd? Yeah, yell out a response. I'll say it if they can hear it. You want to have anything to say?
Who's the recipient of my research?
Well, how do you get it? How do you get it out there, and what does it look like? I mean, is it?
This isn't out there yet. This is the first time I've ever sort of paraded this. So I've published 2 books. This is a completely different world of research to me.
Will this end up as a book or as an article?
No, this is the first little bit I've done. I imagine that this project will be much more broadly interesting to a wide variety of people than work I've done before. At least I hope so.
Great.
I think the interest in adolescent fiction is pretty high. It's robust, and I like to think the interest in Victorian literature is deep.
So we'll see how it represents. But keep the movie rights. That's my advice to you, Eileen. Definitely keep the movie rights. I can't see who that is, but it's someone.
Hi.
Hi.
Give me 1 second. Okay, sorry, I wanted to write something down. But one observation that I've been making is sort of the vocabulary that we've been using. One thing that Janice said was like a change and so forth, and I thought of that as being a metamorphosis because we're reading Metamorphoses in one of my classes. And in that class, we talk about sort of the translation of things, translation theory. So I think a lot of what's been going on is translating your actions into another action, or it's not a complete thought. There we go. So metamorphosis of women's femininity and so forth, as well as the metamorphosis of swimming position into swimming action, and how all of that translates into maybe a form of communication. I'm not exactly sure, but
Great.
that's sort of what I was thinking.
Thank you.
Hi. Oh gosh. What I found interesting, I guess, was what you both do as educators, and that's taking things like Victorian literature, which I have minuscule knowledge about, and like relating it to 50 Shades of Grey, which awkwardly I know more about, obviously now. And Dr. McLean talked about taking his scientific knowledge and relaying it to his swimmers who aren't biomechanists, but it's not about what you know, but how you relay it to the audience or your person that you're trying to talk to. So, yeah.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yes, please. Helene. I think it's Helene. Helene, right over here in the center.
My connection is that institutions and technologies that are assumed to be progress actually need to be studied and reflected upon. And I was thinking about the public library and the wedge.
The public library, what was the last word?
The wedge.
Thank you. Thank you. Somewhere I can't see. The person there, somewhere.
Hello. Okay. I thought there was an interesting crossover of sensationalization across both talks, because the way the sensationalized literature was affecting the maturation of the young Victorian girls is sort of, thought that was sort of related to the way the sensationalization of sport and performance itself sort of affects how swimmers would perform. And so like the performance of a girl in Victorian, I guess England, would be very affected by what they are receiving from their outside sources, but this was same with the swimmers, as their performance is very dependent on like their environment and the type of pool where they are, et cetera.
Great. Thank you. Yes, please, Will.
I was trying to keep my outlook on these lectures clean and clear, just like Dr. Clean and Dr. McCleere. So there's one. Tally that up. But the other thing I was looking at is in the field of kinesiology, the goal was efficiency for the start. And then in the English, the goal was adolescent sensationalism. And how both of those, it opposes exactly what the public wants, and that point was brought up earlier. But once the feelings were communicated to the adolescent, and once there was possibly a faster start found, the other countries were like, oh, no, we haven't found out about that yet, so we can't do it. And then the parents, again, pushed it away. So it's the role of the public.
Thank you. Right here in front.
I found that in both talks, it seemed like they existed in constantly changing environments, and they would push us to question not only what we see, but what we think.
Great. Thank you.
Was an inevitability of outcome. Like, you will finish the race, and you will grow up. It's just how information hinders or helps that process.
Thank you. Very nice. Who else is out there? Oh, yes, this young lady right here.
Okay. I think that what I noticed was just what both lecturers kind of said about the human spirit. While the swimmers, I think their determination and their human spirit is so huge, like one fraction of a second is a big deal to them. While the adolescent females reading these books, in a tree or whatever, they're still figuring out who they are, and their human spirit is developing. So I like the kind of contrast, I guess. I don't know if this is considered a connection, but the developed, determined human spirit, while the other is developing and finding itself and maturing.
Thank you. Wonderful. Where else? Yes, way in the back. Looks like Melissa, maybe.
It is me. I thought that there is something interesting in terms of the type of knowledge, again, the way that science can produce very quantitative technological advances, And that then something from the humanities can give us a very qualitative approach that asks us questions about what are the repercussions of that. So scientific, someone like Freud talks about the importance or the danger of female sexuality, and that then we can sort of consider what it means to control female sexuality in the same way that we might control the body of an athlete.
Thank you. Mac for a second time around.
Something from Dr. McLean's lecture that I thought was important just in general for life was the importance of organization and really putting down what the goals are and breaking it down. Contrastingly, I think with the Victorian young girls, they were, because of that maturation, they're not as organized in their thoughts and knowing what their goals are and what they want to do. And I think it's ironic that the name of the model Dr. McLean proposed was the deterministic model for organization, and those women are trying to determine what they want to be.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more before a fancy reception right here, and then questions.
I'm going to stick my neck out and say, simplistically, I think both of the lectures were about exploration. Exploring how to get to the end of the pool faster, and perhaps with the literature exploring about growing up faster.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, these are absolutely fantastic. I hope that you agree with me that these are wonderful. Any few that I had, people have already said, so they're all gone, unfortunately. Except two things I'll just throw out for your consideration. One is that both of these presentations, in some sense, were to me talking about appropriate versus inappropriate. I mean, is it kind of cheating to make the things different and therefore to change the sport from maybe just standing literally at the edge of the pool, and this idea of what's appropriate, inappropriate, that a father would find this book and throw it away, and then years later, after time, all of a sudden these kind of readings are college reading material in some sense. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was the transition. Both of these talks, I think at the heart, we're talking about transition. People mentioned time, which was one of my things. But the idea that, literally we're talking about a single moment. It's the passage to adulthood, as one speaker said, and of course this transition of going from dry to wet. That moment of starting a race. These are kind of instantaneous moments in one's life, and yet something very, very profound is happening. It's the interface of the kind of the before and the after, which I see in both of these. What a thought-provoking conversation. I urge you to stay out and enjoy some of the refreshments and enjoy the speakers and ask them questions and share more. Please thank them once again for this amazing afternoon.